if you have $10,000 and you have to invest it somewhere but can't touch it for 10 years, what would you choose? And so they could choose between 4 options. It would be US dollars, gold, US stocks, or Bitcoin. And almost half of the population would choose US dollars. So that's 46%. 22% would go with gold. 18% would go with US stocks, and 13% would go with Bitcoin.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, any surprises there so far?
I thought Bitcoin would be lower at the beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought, because, you think about this as a very early technology, even though it's 10 years old, and there's some estimates between the low end. The Tom Lee from Fundstrat has done some research, and he says that he thinks it's like 500,000 people own Bitcoin. But that's a really low estimate. On the high end, there's been some other research, and it goes as high as 50 million people own Bitcoin. But regardless, those numbers are really small compared to the population of the world, right?
Right.
But when you get into like India and China and all these giant countries where Bitcoin adoption isn't very high, then it skews the total population numbers. But still, 13% of people in the U.S. answering Bitcoin is good. It's the more people that own Bitcoin, the better, more favorable the laws will be towards using Bitcoin, and
Right.
less likely governments will want to attack it and stuff. So it's good to see that the Bitcoin number is high as 13.
Yeah. I think so too. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like on the map, right? So that's a great start.
And it also tells you too right away that the mindset of most people is almost like they're in a scarcity mindset because they want the cash now. Like it basically is what that answer is. The $10,000 is like, oh, I want cash, because they're probably in debt. They probably have to pay like all their bills by the time their paycheck comes in. It's gone because of their bills. So they just see cash and they're probably like, yeah, I want cash. What
Right.
is gold? What's Bitcoin? Stocks aren't for me. That's for rich people. So yeah, it's cool to see half of the people are going to want the dollars at the beginning of the survey.
Right, which is interesting because $10,000, nothing would happen to it in 10 years. So it's actually you would end up getting less to some degree.
Right.
So yeah, interesting choice. And then in
What
terms
did you
of
think?
what did I think?
Yeah.
No
Did you think it
specific
was
thoughts.
going to be do you think Bitcoin is going to be higher or lower at the beginning?
I didn't have a benchmark whatsoever, but I think I have interesting thoughts about how it fluctuated as the survey went on,
Okay.
and also the differences between like genders, for example, right? Between in the U.S. dollars, how was that split between male and female, and their own I guess portfolio. So there was actually more female that ended up choosing U.S. dollars. 54% of females would go with US dollars, which is higher,
Okay.
and while 36% of men chose US dollars. So that's lower. And in terms of Bitcoin, you were surprised that it was at 13%, but women only would only take Bitcoin 7%, and men were up at 19%. So that's also interesting. You can already see, male skewing towards Bitcoin and female kind of shying away from it.
Right. Yeah. Why do you think it is that the women would choose the cash more than the men would?
That's a very good question. As we move along, we actually end up seeing that women are actually a lot more cautionary with many of the choices that they make and many of the statements that they feel most connected to. So not sure, but you know what? Next time we could also, when we run this in a few other markets, we could also leave an open-ended question, right? Why did you choose what you did?
Oh yeah, good point.
So let's definitely add that in to hear, what their reasoning is.
Yeah, that'd be good data.
Yeah, agreed. So we will add that in. And so on this question, if we look at generation effects and how that spread is, within Bitcoin. So we actually only have 4% of boomers that chose Bitcoin. And for the rest of the generations, like Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z, that was actually quite consistent among them, around the 14 and 15% mark of those
Okay.
generations who chose to invest in Bitcoin.
And that's about what I'd expect from all the other data that you get put out by some of the exchanges and I think some other cryptocurrency funds have done similar types of research just on the generational side.
Yeah.
And it definitely shows more interest in by millennials, but it's not like 50% or anything like that. It's
Right.
yeah, it's just but triple or quadruple, but it's not like they have a high base to start from because boomers are not that knowledgeable about Bitcoin at all. So it doesn't take much to have more interest than a boomer in Bitcoin.
Fair enough. Yeah, and we'll see this trend like throughout the data, and just as a fun fact, because I know a few boomers, a few parents and aunts and uncles that love their gold, and that was also a very big trend that boomers were very much into investing in gold more so.
And that's why too I'm really excited to run this survey in India and China and
Yeah.
other places, because a lot of places in the Arab world and the Middle East and stuff, they don't trust the banks naturally there. They keep their money in at home, and people view the banks as a tool of the government in most places. And in India, it's like gold is very common. Like people own gold more than I think dollars. So it'd be interesting to see the results between the countries once we get that data too.
Absolutely, yeah, in different markets. That'll be super interesting. And then our last one on this question is about socioeconomic status. So we looked at the differences between poverty, low income, middle class, and wealthy. And so within Bitcoin, we actually had 22% of those in the wealthy socioeconomic class want to invest in Bitcoin. And that was significantly higher than any of the other classes, which hovered around the 12% mark for poverty, low income, and middle class.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's expected, right? If someone's got more money, they're thinking more about managing their portfolio. They're probably reading the financial section of the newspaper and,
Exactly.
paying attention to that stuff. So that makes sense.
Yeah, they have more money to put in different places and probably want to differentiate their portfolios.
But it's interesting to see the gap there between poverty, low income, and middle class. There's a dip at low income.
Yeah.
And I wonder, maybe that's just a statistical anomaly or something, but it would actually make sense to me, because if someone is in poverty and they hear Bitcoin and they see the FOMO about Bitcoin's going up, like that would have probably affect someone in poverty more than someone who's working a minimum wage job or whatever. And maybe they're not struggling so as much, so they're not in like fight or flight mode. They're just kind of existing and spending their time with their family and watching Netflix and stuff. So they're not as much of a struggle as the person in the poverty. So someone in poverty is probably more motivated to pay attention to whatever the heck can get them out of poverty.
I actually think that's such an interesting observation, because in a lot of the data, we actually saw that the poverty and the wealthy classes were more similar, and the low income and middle classes were oftentimes more similar. So
that makes sense. I mean, I saw recently, like 6 months or so ago, when Andrew Yang started to announce his, good numbers for his campaign, and he was talking about universal basic income. I went and looked at some of the studies that were done in universal basic income, and the consensus that I saw with all the different studies where they actually ran trials was that in Canada and the US, when they run trials on UBI, it has kind of a slightly negative effect on people's ability to want to go work, and because it makes them more comfortable. And then the household, instead of having two working people, will just have one working person, and the other person will stay home with the kids or whatever. And when you do the tests in places like Sudan or India, somewhere where there's a very low like income, and the UBI, instead of it being $800 a month or $1,500 a month, it's only like $200 a month.
Wow.
that actually increases the amount of people that go look for work and start businesses and stuff. So
Mhm.
UBI in like places where there's extreme poverty creates value and creates workers, where in the United States and Canada it kind of has a neutral effect and just creates more feeling of happiness.
And yeah, maybe even complacency to an extent. Like it feels maybe kind of safe here.
Right. So if you're motivated by like a survival mode, then you're going
Yeah.
to do whatever you can, right? So that makes sense why people in poverty would have more of a reaction to Bitcoin than someone that's like living comfortably or living at least like a normal life.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting.